Aiden Holbrook was the kind of teenager every parent wished for: brilliant, polite, and seemingly harmless. Dr. Thomas Holbrook was a respected surgeon, a man who had saved lives and built a flawless reputation. Eleanor Holbrook was a beloved school principal, admired for her dedication and integrity. Together, they were Maplewood's picture-perfect family, until the morning Eleanor was found dead in her kitchen, and a secret buried beneath their home began to bleed into the light. What followed would unravel the terrifying truth that behind their smiles and success lay a darkness no one could have imagined. The Holbrook family lived in an upscale neighborhood on the edge of Maplewood, a town where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors greeted each other by name. Their home, a large white brick house with trimmed hedges and a pristine lawn, stood as a symbol of success. Dr. Thomas Holbrook was admired not only for his accomplishments in the medical field, but also for his generosity. He had saved lives in operating rooms, donated to the local hospital, and sponsored community events. His wife, Eleanor Holbrook, was the principal of Ridgewood High School, respected for her discipline and her commitment to academic excellence. Together, they were seen as role models. Their son, Aiden, was 17, a quiet and unusually intelligent boy who excelled in academics and rarely got into trouble. Teachers praised his essays. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. The Holbrooks were, in every visible way, the perfect family. It was on a cold and rainy November morning when the illusion shattered. At 6:42 a.m., Aiden called emergency services. His voice was calm but firm as he reported finding his mother unresponsive in the kitchen. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Eleanor Holbrook was found lying face down, in a pool of blood, with a kitchen knife lodged between her shoulder blades. Her eyes were wide open, her body stiff. There were no signs of life, no signs of a struggle either. The room was strangely clean, too clean. No broken dishes, no overturned furniture, no fingerprints on the knife handle. Just the body, the blood, and a silence that hung in the air like fog. Thomas Holbrook returned home minutes later, still wearing his hospital scrubs. He had been on a night shift, or so he claimed, and had received the call from his son while driving back. His shock seemed genuine. He dropped to his knees beside Eleanor, then turned away, overwhelmed. He told the detectives that Eleanor had gone to bed early the night before. She'd been tired, possibly stressed from work. He hadn't noticed anything strange. Nothing seemed out of place. The initial theory was home invasion. Maplewood had its occasional crime, but nothing like this. The idea that someone had broken into the Holbrook home and murdered a woman in her own kitchen was terrifying. But the evidence didn't fit the narrative. There were no signs of forced entry. All windows were locked. The alarm system hadn't been triggered. Even the dog, a German shepherd named Rex, hadn't barked, though he was known to be fiercely protective. Something about the scene seemed staged, controlled. Detectives Carter and Lynn, seasoned officers with a reputation for thoroughness, began combing through the house. They took photographs, dusted for prints, and searched for any clue that could explain what had happened. Nothing obvious surfaced. No blood trail leading away from the body. No hair strands. No foreign fibers. No sign of a second person's presence. Only Eleanor, perfectly still, as if placed there with precision. Neighbors were interviewed. Security cameras from surrounding homes were reviewed. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. The only camera that faced the Holbrook home showed nothing but rain and darkness during the hours when the murder likely occurred. Aiden's behavior caught attention. He was too composed for a boy who had just lost his mother. He answered questions clearly and directly, never once breaking down. He said he had woken up early for school, gone to the kitchen to grab breakfast, and found her there. When asked if he had heard anything during the night, he shook his head. No, nothing. As the investigation continued, suspicion slowly turned inward. The illusion of the perfect family began to crack. There were no enemies, no known threats, No reason for an outsider to commit such a calculated act. The detectives couldn't help but wonder if the truth was hiding inside the house itself. Beneath the surface of a flawless family portrait, something dark had taken root, and the blood in the kitchen was only the beginning. Detectives Carter and Lynn knew that something about the Holbrook case wasn't adding up. The crime scene was too precise, too clean. It lacked the usual chaos that followed a violent murder. There were no signs of a struggle, no smeared blood, patterns, no broken objects. Just the body of Eleanor Holbrook and a room that seemed almost staged. With no evidence pointing to an outside intruder, the detectives turned their attention fully to the house itself. They began a room-by-room investigation, examining every drawer, closet, and corner for anything out of place. It was during their sweep of the basement that they discovered something unusual. Behind an old wooden shelving unit stacked with paint, cans and boxes of holiday decorations, Carter noticed faint scuff marks on the floor, marks that suggested the shelf had been moved recently. Curious, they shifted the shelf aside and uncovered a small, rectangular outline in the concrete wall. A hollow thud confirmed their suspicion. There was something behind it. After a few minutes of prying, they opened a hidden door that led to a narrow hallway. It was dark, cold, and lined with thick, soundproofing foam. At the end of the corridor, they entered a room unlike anything else in the house. Sterile white walls, a metal operating table in the center, surgical tools laid out neatly on a tray, and two large medical-grade refrigerators buzzing in the corner. The air was heavy, carrying the unmistakable scent of antiseptic, and something far more disturbing: blood. Inside the refrigerators, detectives found rows of carefully labeled vials and blood bags. Each one had a date, an initial, and a handwritten code. One bag stood out immediately. It was labeled EH with a date just 3 weeks before Eleanor's murder. A sample of her blood. The realization struck hard. Someone had drawn Eleanor's blood weeks before she was killed. And this wasn't a standard blood collection. It was being stored in the kind of environment designed for long-term preservation. Other samples bore initials the detectives didn't recognize: JC, MT, LV, names that didn't appear anywhere in the Holbrook family records. They suspected the initials belonged to other individuals, but there was no documentation to explain the purpose of this collection. No medical files, no consent forms, just vials and bags of blood, methodically organized and hidden away. When Dr. Holbrook was questioned, he appeared genuinely surprised by the discovery. He claimed he had no idea the room existed. According to him, the basement was primarily used for storage, and any medical supplies he had brought home were kept in his upstairs office. He said it was impossible for him to maintain a second lab like this without someone noticing. Carter and Lynn weren't convinced. A setup this elaborate didn't appear overnight. It required planning, equipment, and knowledge. Forensic analysis began immediately. Technicians worked to identify the origins of the samples and match the DNA to any existing criminal or missing persons databases. Within a few days, a breakthrough came. One of the samples matched a case from 4 years earlier: Jamie Crest, a 21-year-old college student who had disappeared after attending a health fair in a nearby town. Her case had gone cold, with no leads, no suspects, and no trace of her ever found. But her blood had been sitting in the Holbrook basement the entire time. The investigators faced more questions than answers. Who had built this room? Who had drawn this blood? And why? The hidden lab suggested more than just curiosity. It hinted at a pattern, a purpose, something methodical and deeply disturbing. Dr. Holbrook, with his medical background, was still the prime suspect in the eyes of many. But there were no fingerprints in the room, no signs that he had been there recently. Then, surveillance footage from inside the Holbrook home revealed something even more unexpected. Aiden, the teenage son, had entered the basement multiple times, late at night over the past few months, always alone, always careful. He would stay for hours, and when he returned, he carried nothing with him. No blood, no evidence. Just silence. The investigators now had a new theory, one that was difficult to believe but impossible to ignore. The quiet, intelligent boy who had seemed like the least likely suspect was now at the center of something much darker. And the blood hidden beneath the Holbrook home was only the start of what was to come. With Aiden Holbrook now under a quiet but intense focus, Detectives Carter and Lynn began peeling back the layers of his seemingly spotless life. On the surface, he was an academic standout, honor roll student, winner of multiple science fairs, and recipient of glowing recommendations from teachers. But as the investigation dug deeper into his digital life, a far more chilling version of Aiden began to emerge. His personal laptop was password protected and encrypted, requiring digital forensics experts to bypass the barriers. When they finally gained access, what they found was deeply unsettling. Buried beneath school assignments and innocent web searches was a hidden partition on the hard drive. It contained folders with cryptic titles, symbols, and lengthy journal entries spanning over 2 years. One folder in particular stood out. It was named The Process. Inside were hundreds of files, medical diagrams, biochemical research papers, and handwritten notes about something Aiden referred to as blood integrity. According to these notes, Aiden believed that certain people possessed rare biological traits in their blood that made them superior. Not in the traditional genetic sense, but in what he called resonant purity, a pseudoscientific idea that had no basis in real medicine. He described an obsession with identifying and collecting these rare blood types. His journal entries revealed he had been conducting secret interviews and tests on individuals he considered candidates. In many of the files, he referred to his mother simply as E.H. and to his father as T.H. But he also referenced others, initials that matched the blood bags found in the basement. These were the subjects, people he had targeted for what he called extractions. Even more disturbing was a folder titled Failures. It contained case logs of test subjects who had allegedly not survived the procedure. No names, just numbers and vague details of physical breakdowns. While it wasn't enough to directly tie Aiden to any known deaths, the language was clinical, detached, and completely lacking in empathy. Aiden hadn't just been collecting blood. He had been experimenting. Digital records also showed that Aiden had been active on several encrypted forums under the username VitrianX. These forums were home to fringe communities, disgraced medical professionals, rogue scientists, and individuals discussing unethical human experimentation. Through this network, Aiden had made contact with a user known only as Helix42. Tracing the digital footprint of this user eventually led detectives to a name: Lucas Vane. Lucas Vane was a former medical lab technician with a dark past. Years ago, he had been dismissed from his position after evidence surfaced that he had altered blood test results and accessed patient records illegally. Since then, he had disappeared from the public eye, using false identities and moving across state lines. Vane had the technical knowledge Aiden lacked and the moral absence to support the boy's growing obsession. Security footage from the school provided more evidence. Aiden had been leaving campus with a private vehicle, one that didn't belong to his parents. The driver, identified through grainy images and enhanced license plate tracking, was Lucas Vane. The two had formed a quiet partnership. Vane would transport Aiden to off-site locations where he could access equipment, meet his subjects, and continue his experiments away from the house. The full picture was beginning to emerge. Aiden Holbrook, driven by a twisted belief in blood purity and guided by someone with the skills to help him, had created an underground operation. Eleanor, his mother, had likely discovered what was happening. Perhaps she had found his journals, or maybe she had followed him into the basement. Whatever she learned had scared her enough to confront him. And that confrontation, the detectives now believed, had cost her life. It was no longer a question of whether Aiden was involved. The evidence was overwhelming. The real question was how far his reach had extended, and how many more victims were hidden behind the secret he had spent years protecting. As the evidence closed in on Aiden Holbrook, law enforcement prepared to make a quiet but strategic move. Given the calculated nature of his activities and his connection to Lucas Vane, authorities feared that Aiden might attempt to flee or destroy remaining evidence. Surveillance was increased, and plainclothes officers were stationed around the Holbrook residence. However, before any arrest could be made, the situation escalated beyond control. At 2:17 a.m., just 3 days after Aiden's connection to Lucas, Vane was confirmed. A fire broke out in the Holbrook home. Flames tore through the upper floors, and by the time firefighters arrived, much of the structure was engulfed. Miraculously, Dr. Holbrook had been away on an overnight shift at the hospital. But Aiden was unaccounted for. Hours later, after the blaze was subdued, a charred body was found in the ruins of the basement. Initial visual analysis suggested it belonged to Aiden, but identification wasn't immediate. The body had been burned beyond recognition. What investigators did find, however, was far more telling. A fireproof safe, hidden beneath a floorboard in the basement hallway, had survived. Inside were more journals, detailed, dated, and horrifying in their clinical tone. These were not the early ideas of a curious teenager. These were precise records of individuals, procedures, failures, and results. It was now evident that Aiden's operation had expanded further than anyone had imagined. The victims weren't just from Maplewood or neighboring towns. Some names and initials matched missing persons reports from 3 different states. Forensic analysis later confirmed the body belonged to Lucas Vane, not Aiden. The fire had been a cover. Aiden had staged his own death. Using Vane's body, likely drugged and placed in the basement before the fire, he had bought himself time to disappear. The DNA match came from dental records recovered in the scorched remains. Once again, Aiden had outmaneuvered authorities with disturbing precision. A nationwide manhunt began. Airports, train stations, and bus terminals were alerted. Facial recognition systems were engaged using every recent image of Aiden available, but he had vanished without a trace. No credit card activity, no phone usage, no digital footprint. It was as though he had never existed. Back at the site of the fire, a final discovery confirmed the depth of his deception. Behind a removable wall panel in the lab was a hidden file, a single folder marked Phase 2. Inside was a USB drive containing a manifesto. In it, Aiden outlined his belief that human advancement required sacrifice. He referred to his victims as data points and claimed he was working toward what he called the next evolutionary threshold. It was not about bloodlines or medical breakthroughs. It was about transformation, changing the human body from the inside out, starting with the blood. His experiments weren't random. They were part of a larger, long-term design. He claimed the initial phase was complete. The second would begin when the world stopped watching. Months passed. Leads went cold. The case, while technically open, faded from the headlines. But the public fascination never waned. Documentaries, podcasts, and forums speculated about Aiden's whereabouts. Was he alive? Was he still experimenting? No one knew. But then, 6 months after the fire, a small package arrived at the Maplewood Police Department. It contained a single vial of blood, chillingly labeled PT-01, and a note with just 6 words: "The process continues. Keep watching." The handwriting matched Aiden's journals. The blood inside the vial, once tested, didn't match any known victim or individual in the criminal database. Its chemical structure showed anomalies, modifications that had no logical medical explanation. The case of Aiden Holbrook was no longer just a murder investigation. It had become something more, something larger, more terrifying, and far from over. The secret behind the blood was not just the tale of a family's collapse. It was the beginning of a mystery that had only just begun to unfold.